Well, you walked me into my next question, and it has to do with some philosophy and religion. There was a philosophical concept that has gone all the way back to the Greeks, and over time has had different variations of it, known as hedonism, and it goes all the way up to John Stuart Mills. And really, what it talked about was pleasure versus pain. That the root of life and the concept of life had to do with having pleasure and avoiding pain. And then religiously, that got a bad rap too. Um, and maybe that's a part of it because you mentioned some of the religious stuff, and in my field, we know there's religious trauma. But the hedonism and pleasure didn't go with the martyrdom and sacrifice virtues of many religions. Is threat versus safety just another re-wrapping of those debates?
I would say no. Again, all of those debates um, are these, sort of constructs we create in our uniquely human brain that no other organism on Earth can do. And we convert them into narratives, and then unfortunately sometimes we get really attached to them. They get sort of embedded, or I say impregnated. The brain gets impregnated with a belief that grows. Um, and so I think we're actually kind of trying to fight against those types of concepts to just simply look at sort of the biology. How does a life form interpret its environment and convert that into genetic expression and physiology throughout the body. Um, but let's go back um, to sort of pain and pleasure. So we try to avoid pain, sort of at all costs. And a lot of medicine now is focusing on the elimination of pain because we shouldn't experience pain. We should only experience pleasure in our lives. Again, that's a bad paradigm. That's a false paradigm. Pain is a signal. Pain is one of the fire alarms that says, "Hey, something's wrong here." And again, it can be, physical pain, somatic pain. Something's too hot, something's too bright, something's too loud, something's too sharp. Um, those types of pains, and we have to look at pain as a signal. Something is threatening, right? And let's talk about threat because threat in and of itself is complex. Not just the threat load being complex, but threat is complex because threat can be real, right? It can be predicted, right? And so organisms learn how to, based on past exposures, past patterns, how to be able to predict threat. The brain is more of a predictive organ than it is an objective organ. So we have to remember that. So pain can be real, it can be predicted, it can be potential, it can be remembered. A memory pops up that is something that is threatening to us, even a flashback, a dream kind of thing. Um, but threat can also be imagined, and that's probably the unique thing that the human brain can do is to play with concepts and develop these ideations that turn into more kind of rigid constructs that convert to our narratives and ultimately can convert to belief. So we have to acknowledge that that's part of being human. And although I like to focus on how other organisms react to threat and think that we need to be more like that, we can't escape the evolution of the human brain. And I think the other one that's really important is that threat can be relative. Okay. So
Right.
biologically, we are geared to try to find equity, in equity, we human beings have a emotional and visceral reaction to that, that something isn't right, and it activates our threat physiology. And so when we see the gross inequities in the world today, it's no wonder, we're living in a world of chronic threat, of which, some people are relatively safe in the world, but when they have so much less than other people, it triggers a threat response. And that threat response
Oh,
will, over, so we have 4 billion years of sort of this evolution of our threat response. Homo sapiens, we've only been around for 250, maybe 300,000 years. So we haven't been around.
what was it like back then for you?
I mean, we were living in little bands. We weren't even
Oh,
yet, and we were
yeah.
kind of just like ancient bacteria 4 billion years ago, right? The individual has to survive, so you've got some individual instincts and strategies to survive, but we get into something here that also is part of the theory that needs to be attended to is, we talk so much about meaning and purpose, and we create all these constructs, narratives, and beliefs around meaning and purpose, and sort of the false self, the ego needs that are really not, kind of the true self that needs to be taken care of. We try to take better care of our constructed self, our false self, than our real self. But as far as I can tell, the only real purpose of life is to protect and propagate the genetic code of your species, right? Everything else
Okay.
is construct, narrative, and belief. Um, and so when we frame it that way, it's really about the protection piece, right? Is the survival piece, is figuring out how to survive all the threats in the world. The propagation piece is when we get to safety. Now we can not only devote resources to growth and regeneration, health and happiness, but we are also reproductive, right? Sexual drive's different, our fertility's different, right? And we also have an epidemic of sexual dysfunction and kind of infertility issues in the modern world today.
Well, and we also have a whole market to address it that makes a lot of
Yeah, again, with pills and procedures, same thing.
money. Right.
That's how we choose to solve it versus looking at where we are, in our genetic expression, where we are in our phenotype along the spectrum of threat to safety. Um, a long story there is pain is a signal that something's wrong, and pleasure is really more designed to, if something felt good, it tasted good, it sounded good, that was sort of pleasing and restorative to us, there will be an element of pleasure with it, right?
Sure.
Problem with seeking pleasure is the pleasure network in our system, it involves neurotransmitters like dopamine, and and that can mean the development of addictions. And
Okay.
so seeking pleasure is not, avoiding pain is not the right answer. Pain is a necessary signal. If we don't have pain signaling, the organic quickly becomes the inorganic, right?
Mm.
Or if we ignore pain signaling, same thing. Um, but but if we go all in on seeking pleasure, we also get into a maladaptive mode and even a maladaptive physiology of wanting to sort of feel good all the time, which is impossible to do, right? I mean, threat is inevitable. Pain is inevitable. Suffering, though, is somewhat avoidable.
Mm.
Age, maybe that is not always true. Um, so, and there's some really interesting work even on immune cells, and how immune function varies based on people that are leading a lifestyle seeking pleasure, a hedonistic lifestyle, demonstrating that even in that state, our immune cells start to look more like a threat phenotype than a safety phenotype. So again, just as in medicine, we need to stop focusing on the symptoms and start focusing on the total threat load. Uh, we also need to stop focusing on seeking pleasure, which is our culture, right? Uh,
Sure.
and start focusing on seeking safety. Because when we're safe, we feel things like contentment and happiness and joy. And sometimes we even experience awe. Things like that come out of safety physiology, and pleasure is accessible to us, but not addictive to us when we're in safety. So stop trying to avoid pain. Listen to it as a signal and stop seeking pleasure. Learn to offload your threat load and learn to seek safety, and we're going to be healthy and happy in that paradigm. Not all the time, but most of the time, if we follow that.
So it's interesting. That was quite a journey, right? When we talk about where we start, but I want to go. I mean, it makes sense, but I want to go back a little bit because you took us through some evolutionary psychology and philosophy, right? The survival of the fittest, which isn't what you said, but you kind of eased into kind of what that meant. But you also talked about the perceived inequity, right? So in the field of mental health that I'm in, we have this concept where somebody could walk in the door and their competing nature has driven them to depression and what you call threat two physiology, right? Or maybe threat one, which is more, it seems more anxious, um, because their kids, somebody else's kids are better than their kids at soccer, or their house isn't as big as somebody else. But also, then even going down the line, people that look across the street at the ease of somebody's life, and yet they can't seem to ever get there, even though they do make enough money to feed the family, enough money to provide, but they don't have the extravagant vacations. They don't have the nicer car. None of that is really, they're not really in threat, at least in Maslow's hierarchy, right?
Right. Basic needs are being met, but they have certain emotions like envy and Schadenfreude and
Right.
and things like that. So those are also signals to us. Those are very biological. They're not from some form of character defect or brain defect or whatever. They're just biological drives because we have this drive for some element of equity. If you think of us living in bands or maybe in small tribes, there was more equity. Available in those types of settings, and people, took care of each other and each other's needs. Nobody took too much, right? In the book, there's also a concept of discussing morbid wealth. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. Um, but I think that we have to accept those emotions as telling us something doesn't quite feel right in the world, and we we can get counseling to try to even think our way out of that, like rationalize it to make it go away. But it's not a great substitute for actually having more of a an equitable world.
Hmm. So, as a doctor, medical doctor, what I'm hearing a line, I think, is any threat can come in all sorts of forms, and acute threat, chronic threat, compounding threat, things that add on. But a lot of it comes down to how we feel about or perceive something. And if we just change our mindset, then we'll be healthier. We won't have myofascial pain. We won't have cancer cells.
Yeah, I mean that's really hard to do, and and I know that most mental health interventions, whether it's a pill or cognitive behavioral kind of therapy or other other forms of therapy, the things that are most popular now are pills, mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy. That they're only really about 20 to 30% effective, and so. I think when we try to approach it as, as um, getting your mind right, and we're ignoring the environment that we're living in, and as I've said before, it's, the total environment, um, then we're really unlikely to be successful in approaching it that way. And so it's not that there isn't a place as part of the algorithm, of treatment for digging into maladaptive sort of thinking and reframing things for people. But it's just one piece of sort of this long, if you want to call it a threat ladder, I always kind of think of generational, historical, physical, emotional, social, mental, behavioral, societal, and spiritual, ending with existential threat. There's just a lot there that needs to be addressed other than the mind. The mind only influences um, the 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 body so much, and there's just so many other things that are also kind of influential in that process. Oh, in your last question too, the other piece of that is, social media, or really it's our tendency as human beings to want to create this false self, and so our expression to the world is, it tends to want to let the world know that we've got it all right, we've got it all figured out potentially, everybody else is the problem, and then we try to kind of buff things up, shine things up, um, and so behind those doors of the neighbor that we're envious of, they may have a significant amount of threat in their lives and dysfunction. They may have more material things, um, but we really don't know what the reality behind those doors are. And social media has just doubled down on that imaging,
Mm.
polishing kind of thing, that ultimately, when we're protecting the false self, when we're protecting sort of our ego and our sense of where we fit into society, and the social network and the culture, we're still in threat physiology in that mode, and so we're going to have more disease, disability, pain, suffering, and poor health, because of those mechanics as well.
Mm. So how would we know? Um, what are some signs, right? How do we know? So let me reframe this because I want to think about it in the terms of my own self interest in ego because I'm under threat, and so that makes me less empathetic and more self centered, right? Which is what it says in the book, and
Yeah.
my ex wife says. So when we're thinking about this, I have a client come in. How am I, even if they're not saying they're in threat, what are some signs and signals I'm going to see of threat or that they're getting better in safety if I have somebody that's really struggling, on that threat ladder we talked about?
Yeah, well, so they're going to come in, and they may not just blurt out a full history. They may be a little guarded and all that type of thing. But you know what they're going to do is they're going to tell you about their symptoms, and coming in to see you, they may say, I'm not sleeping well, I'm really anxious, or I feel depressed, or I feel suicidal, or something like that. Or they may have a significant thought disorder where reality is getting distorted. um, all of these are signs that they're in threat. just we can just conclude that they have a significant threat load, even if they deny it, right? Again, the symptoms are kind of keeping score for us. And then as we, as we focus more on kind of the body, the symptoms in the body are going to tell us that they're in threat. If we go about ruling out, an infection or a structural lesion or something like that, and that's been ruled out, and yet they continue to have these ongoing symptoms, that we're getting the message there. And then I think also, one of the things that we don't do well, we're in such a hurry, is, we don't necessarily sit with the patient and just observe them, take in what they look like, how are they uh, behaving? What's the affect? What's the kind of emotional expression coming out of them? Even what's their posture and facial expressions? These are all phenotypic and they all change with various levels of threat. So
Mm.
it's not always just going to be we cannot we can't believe what humans say all the time. The brain's
Right.
complicated. So we have to do this more global assessment of, geez, your life looks a little threatening kind of thing, but also you look like you're in a threat phenotype, and these are the symptoms that would be consistent with that. A lot of, I will say, and I think you've experienced this too, is when you explain this to a patient, right, that, they're not broken, that their symptoms are being driven by this, physiologic soup in all of their cells, tissues, and organs. They sometimes have a tremendous sense of relief
Mhm.
that there is somebody who can explain why they feel the way they do.
Right. Well, and I'll say, I mean, what speaks to me in what you're saying, and it isn't very popular necessarily in my field, at least anecdotally, is sometimes the best talk therapy is no talk therapy. Now, that doesn't mean that the therapy part's the important part, not the talk. The talk has all sorts of, the words are symbols. They're noises we make from our face hole that we all understand kind of what it means in certain cultures. But then even within that, what does love mean to somebody? What does peace mean to somebody? What does God mean? What's the universe? These are all subjective and can trigger things or activate people's thoughts based on their experience with them. And yet, if we step back from the words and watch, and this is something I found interesting about your book and some of the people you've worked with, which I'll ask about in a second. When we watch, observe how they're reacting, when we ask them to talk about, what's going on with your jaw right now? Tell me how you're feeling in your body right now. Tell me, why are you so twitchy right now? What do you think is going on? When we put that into an idea of a threat response or a safety response, I'm peaceful, I'm joyful, I'm content, my body feels relaxed. We seem to learn more about where, I mean, is the right word, triggers, activations, threats, assume threats where they are. I mean, how do we address the prefrontal cortex idea of safety or threat and then the rest of our experience? Does that make sense?
Yeah, again, I think that what I will go to a lot is animals, dogs, my dog's barking. Um,
It's all right. Mine took a leak on the living room floor here about 10 minutes ago.
and um, and how we comfort them, how we communicate with them. I mean, my dog does understand a couple of words, somewhat, but by and large, it's not with symbolic communication. It's not with language. It's not with sapiocortical functions. And so it's with, intonation and facial expressions and touch and, going out and playing and, and things like that. Well, we still got all that in us, right? Sometimes our human brain kind of likes to override all that stuff. And we can look at how we communicate with babies, right?
Mm,
Before language really comes on board, or even at the end of life, right? With a demented parent, um, that explaining things to them is like asking a blind man to see. And so you have,
mm,
how do I make this person who is, starting to lose their sapiocortex, right? How do I make them feel safe and comfortable in the world? And talking at them isn't it. So it does beg the question that, so much of our therapeutic design is talking at people and giving them advice, and not necessarily really looking at the types of things that actually make people feel safe in the world. And
yeah.
and so I think we have to be we have to be guarded about, you know, overthinking things, um, and creating too many constructs, narratives, and beliefs. We have to be a little guarded about giving advice, and we have to focus on, again, more on how we make people safe in the world. And let me comment on thinking and thoughts too, because um, our physiology will drive our thoughts, right? Our physiology drives our physical body. Our physiology determines what our internal organs are doing, of which our brain is one of those internal organs. Our physiology changes our emotions. It changes how we socially connect with people. Our physiology changes our thoughts. So when we get dark thought bubbles coming up and getting to our cortex, to our awareness, right, pops into our head, we have to recognize that too is a signal. An aversive kind of thought, a dark thought, is simply a signal that somehow, some way, we're perceiving threat in the world. What we have to be careful about doing is taking those dark thoughts and, sort of reformatting them through our thinking process, right? Which may not be a good way to term it, maybe through our cognitive processes, where we take these dark thoughts that are just meant to signal to us something is wrong in the world, and then we sort of co-opt them and create a construct, something more concrete out of them. And from that, then we develop a narrative around them. As you pointed out earlier, when you mentioned victim, martyr, hero stories, we
Right.
create around them, and they become our beliefs and become sort of a pseudo reality. So we have to be better at differentiating what our thoughts are from what our thinking processes are. Um, and I suspect even my dog has certain thoughts, right, that bubble up.
Well,
Um,
of course, you doesn't know why you're leaving him and when you'll ever be back,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
And what they don't necessarily do is all the other machinations to create
Right.
big
Right.
life of its own.
Yeah. Well, they don't then go on to, Instagram, create a reel about how they've been victimized by it, and then, gain followers to help them justify it and feel validated in their pain, right? So
Yeah,
uh,
she
it
hurt
ends up being different.
she hurt her leg chasing a deer, and I haven't yet tried to debrief that trauma with her. So
Right. Right. What do you think the deer was feeling in that moment? Um, well, and so it's an interesting concept, right? Because you mentioned victim, martyr, hero stories, which is one of my big things, and I want to put this into the context of some of the people you've been working with as you've refined this theory. Um, and so the victim, martyr, hero story, which you mentioned in the book, I believe you meant, yeah, no, I know you did. There weren't very many pictures, so it was hard for me to get through this.
it is hard.
Uh, yeah. But I do know there's victim, martyr,
The
hero story.
book is admittedly a little bit of a little bit of a burden, uh,
A threat in its own right. Is that what you're doing?
but it's foundational, and I
Right.
think there will be adaptations that hopefully somebody will do. to make it palatable and easier, but we can do some of that here.
Yeah. Well, and so the victim martyr hero story for me, uh, is, we're going about life. We feel content. We're going in our natural up and down the ladder between safety and threat that happens with life. Father Dan cuts us off in traffic, or, the dog chews up a bag of fireworks. These are all things that have happened recently to me. And we're fine. And then something comes that really kind of rocks us. We lose a job, we lose a relationship. And all of a sudden, we start creating that victim martyr hero story of the pain and the victim part of why this hurts. Then we start to make excuses of why I was wronged. Then we start to come back with our redemption arc of our hero story. And we go on our hero quest, but all we do is end up at best where we were. And so we've actually not gone forward in life. And so I attest that that's a big part of us is to be able to let go with that. In the people you've worked with, as I attest theoretically that, if we stop with the stories, we get out of our prefrontal cortex. When you've worked alongside Steve Porges with the polyvagal theory, Peter Levine of somatic experiencing, Sheldon Solomon and terror management, all of these different ideas and people you've spent the last couple of years, how has that influenced that? And what does that say about my idea from a theoretical or from a mental health side of we have to get out of the storytelling?
Yeah, obviously, there's a lot of influences that come into this, and kind of into the theory, and somewhat, again, they're all looking at one of the components of how of what our threats are, or what specifically different physiologic functions are doing within the body. So I think that as as I kind of started at the beginning, this is not something that I necessarily thought up. It was sort of a confluence of information that I set out to try to transcribe. So, I'd like to, point that out. And again, and getting back, I'll digress a minute, getting back to thoughts, we don't want, we don't want to um, take our thoughts and put them into concrete constructs, right? But the other piece of the whole thing is we can't, we don't own those thoughts, right? They come through us. They're not ours. They're not, we can create, cognition and constructs and, and kind of creative stuff. But ultimately, our thoughts are things that come through us, and they're not necessarily even of us. They're based on, again, the environment meeting the genome and how they bubble up. So anyway, ask me your question again, but I wanted to get that out on thoughts.
Yeah, I've forgotten. No, I think the I'm going to rephrase off of what you just said. So going back to physiology in this question, we have the victim martyr hero story. From the victim martyr hero story, if this continues to loop, we don't go anywhere. We end up developing narratives, constructs, and beliefs. How does physiology fit into that? And how does that affect our thinking, our narratives, our constructs, beliefs? I think that's something that is unique to this theory.
Yeah, this may get a little bit more weird.
You literally covered your eyes like a monkey didn't want to see.
I don't want to hear this,
Yes,
but
as we observed threat in action, ladies and gentlemen, that was one of them.
we how weedy do we want to get? But that what I can say is a lot of our physiology is, what people like to say, bottom up, right? It's the environment coming to us, and again, it's the air, it's the water, it's the soil, it's the it's other people, it's social media, all those things are, kind of coming to us that we absorb that activate a threat response. But unique to humans, we have a really, unique brain. And as you were just talking about, the constructs, narratives, and beliefs, um, they can be in conflict with reality, and so the brain itself has this ability when sort of the physiology is bubbling up to the cortex of the brain, which is where we have awareness, and the vast majority, over 99% of what's going on in our bodies, we don't even have much awareness over unless we're really, focusing on it. But when this physiology, thoughts and emotions eventually, kind of they come up through, through the bottom up through part of the brain, called the striatum that pushes these neurotransmitters up to the cortex. Um, but when things are bubbling up that are in conflict with um, kind of how we know we should behave, or how we think we maybe should think, or emotions we don't want to feel. This top part of our brain sort of feeds back down and says, nah, wait a minute, puts kind of the brakes on this more sort of natural physiologic flow. And what we do know about that is when sort of this top brain is sort of in conflict with the natural physiology trying to flow upward, and is kind of, they're kind of doing this against each other. That actually registers in our brain and in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex of the brain as conflict, as any other conflict, and it would register there. And that process then feeds back to develop a full-blown, threat response. It feeds to our amygdala, which is a threat center in the brain, that then, sends signaling out sort of the rest of the brain, and eventually it gets all the way through the entire body. Um, so I think that is, really kind of one of the fundamental concepts or principles in the book is how we sort of generate our own threat response that is an internal thing that is, much more, if not totally specific to human beings.
Hmm. So, I mean, as you talk about the internal conflict, that's something that really registers. Most of people, we don't listen to Freud a lot anymore. Some foundational stuff. He's not as active, but what he said Navosa was essentially the ego, the id, the superego were in conflict with each other. And it sounds like what you're saying is you've actually tried to start to identify what is the physiological and biological
I think,
aspects of that conflict.
yeah, even the anatomical pieces of
Mm.
I don't use, super ego, ego concepts, but they aren't invalid. But I prefer to try.
Just incomplete.
Yeah, I try to put the biology, the physiology and the anatomy kind of behind what's actually going on there. So.
Right. And nothing to do with your mother or anybody else.